Hey y'all! It's entry number 68 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Miles Sanders, running back, Philadelphia Eagles. We'll start with the positives with Miles Sanders' fantasy profile. Efficiency. Miles Sanders has been a fairly efficient runner over the course of his career, averaging 5.1 yards per carry across 40 career games, and had 5.3 yards per carry in 2020 and 5.5 yards per carry in 2021. In addition, during the 2021 season, Sanders averaged 5.2 true yards per carry, the third best among running backs, 5.6 yards per touch, the 10th best among running backs, and had 11 runs of 15 or more rushing yards, the 10th best among running backs according to Player Profiler. The next thing I really like about Sanders' fantasy profile is that he's got a great offensive line. The Philadelphia Eagles' offensive line has been one of the best in the NFL over the past few years. At the end of the 2021 season, the offensive line ranked as the fourth best in the NFL according to Pro Football Focus. They are projected to have 4 of the 5 same starters from last year's line in 2022, with the only change being made at right guard. Now going into the 2022 season, the team is projected to have the best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus. Having a great offensive line should be beneficial for Miles Sanders in 2022. The last thing I like about Miles Sanders' fantasy profile for 2022 is that his touchdowns have nowhere to go but up. Miles Sanders scored 0 touchdowns during the 2021 season, which is pretty surprising for a player that saw 163 touches last year. Considering the rest of the Eagles' backfield combined for 15 rushing touchdowns, and Jalen Hurts had 10 rushing touchdowns himself, and Miles Sanders actually led the team in carries inside of the 20 in 2021, he should be at least somewhat competent in the touchdown department in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Miles Sanders' fantasy profile. We'll start with the fact that Jalen Hurts can be a bit of a ball hog on the ground. The Eagles were the second most run-heavy team in the league in 2021, but that can be a little misleading for their backfield, as they ranked tied for the 10th most in halfback carries with 391. Jalen Hurts was actually the team's leader in carries with 139, rushing yards with 784, and rushing touchdowns with 10 in 2021. And as long as he's around, the Eagles' backfield will get poached in certain situations, like Hurts sneaking it in for a touchdown more than some other teams' running backs. The next concern I have with Miles Sanders' fantasy profile is his competition and the potential for a running back by committee approach in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Eagles took more of a running back by committee approach on the ground between Miles Sanders, Boston Scott, Kenneth Gainwell, and Jordan Howard last year. If the team decides to continue to do this in 2022, it will limit Sanders' fantasy upside. Update. Miles Sanders was getting some carries with the second-team offense early in camp, so that makes it clear that they view him as more of a committee piece rather than a bell cow. The third concern I have with Miles Sanders' fantasy profile is his injury woes. Sanders has missed 9 games in the past 2 seasons and played in 72.7% of his games in the last 2 years, and his injury history includes an MCL sprain in 2019, a shoulder sprain in 2019, a hamstring strain in 2020, a knee sprain in 2020, an ankle sprain in 2021, and a hand fracture in 2021 according to Player Profiler. Availability is the best ability, and his body seems to be more fit for a committee role based on his injury history and struggles. Some additional thoughts on Miles Sanders' fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Miles Sanders finished as the RB43 in standard, with 91.2 total fantasy points and 7.6 fantasy points per game. The RB45 in half PPR formats, with 104.2 total fantasy points and 8.7 fantasy points per game, and the RB44 in full PPR formats, with 117.2 total fantasy points and 9.8 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, Miles Sanders had 1 out of 12 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 8 out of 12 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 0 out of 12 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, and 3 out of 12 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, Miles Sanders finished as the RB21 in standard with 142.4 total fantasy points and 11.9 fantasy points per game, the RB23 in half PPR formats with 156.4 total fantasy points and 13.0 fantasy points per game, and the RB23 in full PPR formats with 170.4 total fantasy points and 14.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR, during the 2020 season, Miles Sanders had 1 out of 12 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 12 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 12 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 12 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 2 out of 12 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2019 season, Miles Sanders finished as the RB15 in standard with 168.7 total fantasy points and 10.5 fantasy points per game, the RB15 in half PPR formats with 193.7 total fantasy points and 12.1 fantasy points per game, and the RB15 in full PPR formats with 218.7 total fantasy points and 13.7 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats during the 2019 season, Miles Sanders had 2 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 7 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Run-heavy offense and running back-friendly coaches. The Eagles ran the ball 550 times last year, the second most in the league behind the Tennessee Titans. Head coach Nick Sirianni and offensive coordinator Shane Steichen have both been a part of offenses that feature their running back rooms heavily over the course of their career in an offensive coordinator or head coaching role, which should bode well for the investments in the Eagles' backfield. Some disappointing advanced stats. Miles Sanders has posted a below-average broken tackle percentage of 8.0%, positive run percentage of 88.3%, and percentage of yards after contact with 45.1% in 2021 according to RotoWire. Personal opinion. Miles Sanders is currently going off the board as RB25, about pick 75 overall, on ESPN, and RB27, about pick 68 overall on Yahoo. Sanders is a really odd fantasy player to me because while I feel he is in line for a bit of a bounce back season and has some situational factors in his favor, but looking at this ranking, I don't think I'd move him higher than this running back range for fantasy purposes. The big problem with him from a fantasy standpoint is that Kenneth Gainwell is a superior pass catcher in a Nyheim Hines-light type of role, and both Jalen Hurts and Boston Scott will get some touches around the end zone as well. If Sanders can't seize at least one of these two roles as either the primary pass catching back or the primary goal line back, he will just be a flex play. If he can seize one of these roles, his best shot in my opinion is the goal line back role. He can be a solid RB2. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Miles Sanders has shown support for the Pittsburgh Boys and Girls Club. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.